He cheated a quiet widow at cards but didn't know she'd poisoned 3 husbands and walked free. The poker table at the Silver Dollar Casino sat in the corner where lamplight barely reached. 5 players hunched over their cards like vultures over carrion. Smoke hung in the air thick enough to taste. Outside, the town of Hollow Ridge was settling into another Friday night. Inside, fortunes were being made and lost with each turn of a card. The widow sat in the 4th chair. Her name was Eleanor Price, and she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in faded black mourning clothes that had seen better days. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands were delicate, spotted with age. She played her cards carefully, quietly, the way a woman who had buried 3 husbands might play, like someone who understood that life was a game of patience and loss. Across from her sat Marcus Webb. He was 32 years old, handsome in the way that men who know they're handsome always are. His suit was expensive, his watch chain was gold, his smile was the kind that made women trust him, and men want to be him. Marcus had been playing cards since he was 16 and cheating at them since he was 17. He was good at it. Very good. Good enough that he'd never been caught. Good enough that he'd made a comfortable living traveling from town to town, taking money from people who should have known better. Tonight he was taking money from a widow. Eleanor had been losing steadily for 2 hours. Her pile of chips had dwindled from a respectable stack to a handful. Marcus watched her with barely concealed amusement. She was the perfect mark. Old, alone, probably playing with money she couldn't afford to lose. Money from her dead husbands that she was trying to stretch into something resembling security. Before you find out what happens when greed meets something far more dangerous, hit that subscribe button, leave your like, and tell us in the comments which country you're listening from. Now settle into your chair, check your cards, and stay until the end, because what comes next will teach you that some people survive for reasons you should never underestimate. The hand was building to something significant. The pot had grown to nearly $500. For Hollow Ridge, that was a month's wages for most men. For Eleanor, it might have been everything she had left. Marcus had a full house, kings over 7s. He knew it was a winning hand because he'd made sure of it. The card he'd palmed from the bottom of the deck 3 turns ago was now sitting pretty in his hand. Eleanor was studying her cards with the kind of concentration that suggested she actually had something. Marcus doubted it. The woman had been playing terribly all night, making rookie mistakes, betting emotionally instead of strategically. "I raise," Eleanor said quietly, pushing her remaining chips into the center of the table. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. All in. Marcus felt a flutter of excitement. This was the moment he lived for, the moment when the mark committed everything they had. The other players had already folded, sensing something they couldn't quite name. Now it was just Marcus and the widow. He made a show of considering his options, of studying his cards like the decision was difficult. Finally, he smiled his practiced, charming smile. "Well, Mrs. Price, I hate to do this to you, but I call." He laid down his cards with a flourish. Full house, kings high. Eleanor looked at his cards for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Her eyes, which had seemed watery and vague all evening, suddenly focused with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. Those eyes were not the eyes of a confused old woman. They were the eyes of something else entirely. Something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. "That's a fine hand, Mr. Webb," Eleanor said, her voice still quiet, but somehow different now. Clearer, firmer. "It's a shame you had to cheat to get it." The table went silent. The other players who had been gathering their things stopped. The dealer, a man named Charlie, who'd been running games in Hollow Ridge for 15 years, froze with a deck in his hands. Marcus felt his face flush. "Now hold on," he started, his voice taking on an injured tone. "I don't appreciate accusations." Eleanor reached across the table and took his right hand before he could pull it away. Her grip was stronger than it should have been. She turned his hand over gently, almost tenderly, and there in his palm crease was a telltale smudge of red ink from a marked card. The kind of mark that was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and what light to use. "You palmed the King of Hearts 4 hands ago," Eleanor said, still holding his hand. "You marked the deck 3 hands before that with a solution you keep in your ring. That ring with the large stone that you keep touching. The stone flips open, doesn't it? There's a small reservoir inside, filled with a chemical compound that shows up under certain light conditions." Marcus tried to pull his hand away, but Eleanor held it firm. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I watched you do it," Eleanor replied. "I've been watching you cheat for 2 hours. I let you? I wanted to see how far you'd go. I wanted to see if you'd actually take everything from a widow who looked like she couldn't afford to lose." She released his hand and sat back in her chair. The lamplight caught her face differently now. She didn't look confused or sad anymore. She looked like something carved from stone, something patient and eternal and absolutely certain of itself. Charlie the dealer spoke up, his voice careful. "Mrs. Price, are you saying this man has been cheating at my table?" "I am saying exactly that," Eleanor confirmed, "and I am saying that in any decent establishment, a man caught cheating should return all the money he won dishonestly, leave town, and count himself. Lucky he still has his hands." Marcus stood up quickly. His chair scraped against the wooden floor. "Listen, you old witch, I don't know what game you're playing, but I won that money fair and square." "Sit down, Mr. Webb," Eleanor said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind of command that came from someone who was used to being obeyed. And when Marcus didn't immediately comply, she added, "Sit down, or he'll tell everyone in this room about the warrant for your arrest in Tombstone. The one for cheating a cattle baron named William Hendricks out of $15,000. The one that specifically mentions your distinctive ring and your marked card technique." Marcus sat down. His face had gone pale. "How do you know about Tombstone?" Eleanor smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "I know a great many things, Mr. Webb. I make it my business to know things. You see, I am a widow. That's true. But what people don't ask is why I am a widow 3 times over. Why 3 different men married me, and why all 3 of them died." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the sounds from the rest of the casino seemed to have faded away. Charlie the dealer was watching Eleanor with a mixture of fascination and fear. The other players who had remained were leaning in, unable to help themselves. "My first husband was named Robert Price," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone telling a story they've told before, but never publicly. "He was a banker in St. Louis, a respected man. He was also a man who enjoyed beating his wife when he came home drunk, which was often. I endured it for 3 years. I tried to leave. He found me. He beat me so badly I couldn't walk for a week. So I poisoned him, arsenic in his evening brandy. A little bit every night for 6 months. By the time he died, everyone thought it was his heart. The doctor signed the death certificate without a second thought. Marcus was staring at her now. The color had drained from his face completely. "My second husband was named Thomas Waverly," Eleanor went on, "a lawyer in Denver. Charming, intelligent, respected by everyone who knew him. He was also a man who liked young girls, very young girls. I discovered this 6 months into our marriage when I found his photographs. The things he did, the things he paid to do. I couldn't go to the authorities. He was too powerful, too well connected, so I poisoned him too. This time with something faster. Nightshade berries mixed into his favorite pie. He was dead in 3 hours. Everyone thought he'd eaten something spoiled." "And your third husband?" Charlie asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "Jonathan Crane," Eleanor said, "a mine owner here in Hollow Ridge. You might remember him, Charlie. He died 8 years ago. Everyone said it was pneumonia." And it was pneumonia. Pneumonia I gave him by gradually weakening his system over the course of a year. Small doses of mercury in his coffee. Just enough to compromise his immune system. Just enough that when winter came and the sickness went around, he caught it and couldn't fight it off. She looked directly at Marcus. 3 husbands, Mr. Webb. 3 men who hurt people, who destroyed lives, who walked free because society protected them. I made sure they didn't walk free anymore, and I walked away from each death without anyone suspecting, without anyone questioning. Because I am very good at being underestimated. I am very good at looking like something harmless. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus managed to ask. His voice was shaking. "Because you need to understand something," Eleanor replied. "You came to my table tonight thinking I was a mark, thinking I was an easy target, an old widow who didn't know better. You thought you could take my money and laugh about it later. You thought I was weak. But I'm not weak, Mr. Webb. I have never been weak. I have survived 3 terrible men, and I have made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. I have done things that would horrify most people. And I sleep very well at night." She leaned forward. "So here is what will happen. You will return every cent you won from me tonight. You will leave Hollow Ridge before sunrise. And you will never cheat at cards again. Because if I ever hear that you have, if I ever hear your name connected to another scheme, another mark, another victim, I will find you. And I will make sure that whatever happens to you looks like an accident. Do you understand me?" Marcus nodded. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and began pulling out money. Bills and coins spilled onto the table. All the winnings from the night. All the money he'd taken from Eleanor and the others through his careful, practiced cheating. Eleanor gathered it calmly, counting it with quick, precise movements. "Charlie," Eleanor said without looking at the dealer, "I believe Mr. Webb owes your establishment some money as well, for the use of your table under false pretenses." Charlie nodded slowly. $500 should cover it, and a promise never to return. Marcus pulled out more money. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely count it. When he finally had the amount, he placed it in front of Charlie and stood up. He looked at Eleanor one more time. His face was a mixture of fear and something else, something like respect. "Who are you really?" he asked. Eleanor Price smiled again, that same cold, knowing smile. "Am exactly who I appear to be, Mr. Webb. A quiet widow. The difference is, you finally understand what that actually means." Marcus left the Silver Dollar Casino at a run. Within an hour, he had packed his belongings and was on a horse heading east. He would never return to Hollow Ridge. He would never cheat at cards again. And for the rest of his life, whenever he saw an older woman sitting alone, he would remember Eleanor Price and the lesson she had taught him about underestimating people. Back at the Silver Dollar, Eleanor finished collecting her money and stood up. Charlie, the dealer, watched her carefully. "Mrs. Price," he said slowly, "those things you said about your husbands, were they true?" Eleanor looked at him with those sharp, clear eyes. "What do you think, Charlie?" "I think," Charlie said carefully, "that sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms. And I think that man needed to learn a lesson." "He did," Eleanor agreed. She placed a $50 bill on the table. "For your trouble, Charlie. Thank you for running an honest game." She walked out of the casino and into the night air. Hollow Ridge was quiet now. Most people had gone to bed. The stars overhead were bright and cold and indifferent to human affairs. Eleanor walked slowly back to her small house on the edge of town, the house she had lived in since Jonathan Crane had died. The house that was paid for with money from 3 dead husbands. Inside, she made herself tea and sat in her parlor. On the mantel were 3 photographs: Robert Price in his banker's suit, Thomas Waverly in his lawyer's robes. Jonathan Crane standing proudly in front of his mine. 3 men who had seemed powerful. 3 men who had underestimated the quiet woman they had married. 3 men who had paid for that mistake with their lives. Eleanor sipped her tea and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had spent decades perfecting the art of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being exactly what people expected to see when they looked at an older woman. And that invisibility had been her greatest weapon. It had allowed her to survive. It had allowed her to seek justice where the law would not. It had allowed her to become something that those 3 men had never anticipated: their executioner. The next morning, word spread through Hollow Ridge about what had happened at the Silver Dollar. The story grew in the telling, as stories always do. Some said Eleanor Price had pulled a gun on Marcus Webb. Others said she had used some kind of black magic to read his mind. A few said she had always been strange, that there was something not quite right about a woman who had buried 3 husbands. But most people, the ones who had known her for years, simply nodded and said that Mrs. Price was a survivor, that she had endured more than most people could imagine, that she deserved peace and respect. And if there were whispers about how her husbands had died, well, those were just whispers. There was no proof, no evidence, nothing but the word of a widow who had always been quiet, always been polite, always been exactly what society expected her to be. Eleanor continued her life in Hollow Ridge. She played cards on Friday nights, always at the Silver Dollar, always at the same table. She won some and lost some, but she never lost everything. She never gave anyone reason to think she was anything other than what she appeared to be. And she never had to poison another husband, because she never married again. Years passed. Eleanor grew older. Her hair went completely white. Her hands became more gnarled, with arthritis. But her eyes remained sharp. Her mind remained clear. And her reputation, the quiet reputation of a woman who should not be underestimated, grew slowly but surely. In the 10th year after the incident with Marcus Webb, a young man came to Hollow Ridge. His name was Daniel Cross, and he was everything Marcus had been: handsome, charming, confident. He made his living playing cards, and he was good at it. He heard about the Friday night game at the Silver Dollar and decided to join. Eleanor was there, as she always was. She watched the young man play for several weeks. She saw the way he handled the cards, the way his fingers moved, the subtle tells of someone who knew more than he should about where the cards were in the deck. She recognized the pattern because she had seen it before. One Friday night, Daniel sat down across from Eleanor. He smiled at her the way Marcus had smiled all those years ago. The smile of someone who thought he had found an easy mark. "Good evening, Mrs. Price," Daniel said. His voice was smooth as silk. "I hope you are having a pleasant evening." "I am," Eleanor replied quietly. "And you, Mr. Cross?" Daniel dealt the cards. His hands moved with practiced ease. Eleanor picked up her cards and studied them. She could see the marks on them, invisible to most people, but clear to someone who knew what to look for. Daniel was using the same technique Marcus had used, the same marked cards, the same careful palming. Eleanor played the hand cautiously. She lost a small amount, then another hand, another small loss. Daniel was good at making it look gradual, making it look like chance. But Eleanor could see the pattern. She had always been good at seeing patterns. After 2 hours, Eleanor had a substantial amount of money in the pot. Daniel had a winning hand. She could see it in the way he held himself. The confidence that came from knowing the outcome before it was revealed. The other players had folded. It was just the two of them. "I raise," Eleanor said, pushing all her chips into the center. All in. Daniel's eyes lit up. This was what he had been working toward all night. The big score. He called her bet without hesitation and laid down his cards. 4 of a kind, aces. The table erupted. It was a nearly unbeatable hand. Daniel reached for the pot, his smile growing wider. But Eleanor's hand shot out and caught his wrist. Her grip was strong despite her age, stronger than it should have been. "Before you collect your winnings, Mr. Cross," Eleanor said quietly, Perhaps you should explain how you managed to get 4 aces when the deck was supposed to be clean." Daniel froze. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor turned his hand over, and there, pressed against his palm, was a 5th ace. The ace he had palmed from a deck he had brought with him. The ace he had been planning to switch in at the crucial moment. "Charlie," Eleanor said without looking at the dealer, "I believe Mr. Cross has been cheating at your table." Charlie stood up and came around to look. When he saw the extra card, his face hardened. "Mr. Cross, I think you need to leave. Now." Daniel tried to pull his hand away, but Eleanor held firm. "This is the 2nd time in 10 years that someone has tried to cheat me at this table," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath it. The first man learned his lesson and left town. "I suggest you do the same." She released his hand. Daniel stood up quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "You crazy old woman," he hissed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Eleanor looked up at him with those sharp, clear eyes. "Don't I? Let me tell you who I am, Mr. Cross. I am a woman who has survived 3 husbands, 3 men who thought I was weak, 3 men who learned otherwise. I am a woman who has spent her life being underestimated, and I am a woman who does not appreciate being stolen from." She stood up slowly, her full height impressive, despite her age. "Now you will return every cent you won tonight. You will leave Hollow Ridge. And you will remember that some people survive for reasons you should never underestimate. Do you understand?" Daniel looked around the table. Every face was watching him with a mixture of judgment and curiosity. He looked at Charlie, who had his hand resting on something under the counter. Probably a gun. He looked back at Eleanor and saw in her face something that made his blood run cold. A certainty, a knowledge, the face of someone who had done terrible things and would do them again if necessary. "Yes, Mom," Daniel said quietly. He pulled out his winnings and placed them on the table. Then he left the Silver Dollar Casino without looking back. By morning, he was gone from Hollow Ridge, and like Marcus Webb before him, he would never cheat at cards again. Eleanor collected her money and sat back down. The other players were looking at her with new respect, with understanding. She was not just a quiet widow anymore. She was Eleanor Price, the woman who had buried 3 husbands, the woman who could read a cheat like a book, the woman who should never be underestimated. Charlie brought her a whiskey on the house. "To Mrs. Price," he said, raising his own glass, "the sharpest player at the Silver Dollar." Eleanor raised her glass in return. "To honest games," she said, "and to men who learn their lessons." They drank together, and the game continued. Eleanor played for another hour before calling it a night. She walked home through the quiet streets of Hollow Ridge, her winnings secure in her bag, her mind at peace. She had done what needed to be done, protected herself, protected the honest players at the Silver Dollar, reminded the world that appearances could be deceiving. Back in her house, she made her nightly tea and sat in her parlor. The 3 photographs on the mantel watched her silently. Robert Price, who had beaten her; Thomas Waverly, who had hurt children; Jonathan Crane, who had poisoned his workers with mercury from his mine. 3 men who had seemed powerful. 3 men who had underestimated her. 3 men who had paid the ultimate price. Eleanor had never felt guilty about what she had done to them. They were predators, and predators needed to be stopped. Society had protected them because of their money, their status, their power. But Eleanor had been patient. She had been clever. She had used the one advantage she had, her invisibility, and turned it into a weapon. Some people called it murder. Eleanor called it justice. Justice for herself. Justice for the young girls Thomas Waverly had hurt. Justice for the miners who had died from Jonathan Crane's negligence. The law had failed to protect the innocent, so Eleanor had taken the law into her own hands, and she had never been caught, never even been suspected, because who would suspect a quiet widow? As the years continued to pass, Eleanor's legend grew. She became a fixture in Hollow Ridge, respected and feared in equal measure. People knew not to cross her, not to underestimate her, not to think that her age or her gentle demeanor meant she was weak. She had proved time and again that she was anything but weak. Young women in town began to seek her out, women who were trapped in bad marriages, women who were being hurt, women who needed help but had nowhere to turn. Eleanor would invite them to tea and listen to their stories. She never told them what to do. She never explicitly advised them to take the path she had taken, but she would tell them her own story, about the 3 husbands, about patience, about being underestimated, about survival. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, a husband in Hollow Ridge would die suddenly. A heart attack, a fall down the stairs, an illness that came on quickly and left no time for treatment. And Eleanor would attend the funeral, dressed in her black mourning clothes, and she would comfort the widow. And she would say nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The message was clear. Some women survived by any means necessary. Eleanor Price lived to be 87 years old. When she finally died, it was in her sleep, peacefully, in the house she had made her own. The house bought with money from 3 dead husbands, the house where she had spent decades being exactly what she needed to be. A survivor, a protector, an instrument of justice in a world that often forgot what justice meant. They buried her in the Hollow Ridge Cemetery with full honors. Half the town came to the funeral. The women she had helped, openly or quietly. The honest gamblers from the Silver Dollar. The people who had learned to respect her, to understand that beneath the quiet exterior was someone formidable. On her headstone, they carved a simple inscription: Eleanor Price, beloved widow, survived by her dignity. No one mentioned the 3 husbands. No one talked about the rumors. No one said anything about poison or justice or the careful, patient elimination of men who hurt others. It was all just whispers now, stories, legends. But in Hollow Ridge, for generations afterward, when someone tried to take advantage of someone they thought was weak, someone would tell the story of Eleanor Price, the quiet widow who played cards at the Silver Dollar, the woman who buried 3 husbands and walked free, the woman who proved that the most dangerous person at the table was often the one nobody paid attention to. And young men passing through town, men who thought they were clever, men who thought they could cheat and steal and get away with it, would hear that story and think twice. Because Eleanor Price had taught an important lesson. That survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest or the loudest. Survival was about being patient, about being underestimated, about waiting for the right moment and then acting with absolute certainty. Marcus Webb never cheated again. He became an honest card dealer in a small town in Kansas. He married, he had children. And every night before he went to sleep, he would remember the widow in Hollow Ridge and the look in her eyes when she caught him cheating. The look that said she had done worse things than catch a card cheat. The look that said she was capable of anything. Daniel Cross left the gambling life entirely. He became a shopkeeper in Oregon. He sold dry goods, and he treated his customers fairly. And sometimes, late at night, he would think about the old woman who had grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and seen through his deception like it was written in plain English. He would think about how close he had come to something terrible, and he would thank whatever gods existed that he had been given a second chance. And Eleanor Price, quiet widow, patient survivor, careful killer of evil men, passed into legend. Her story was told in saloons and parlors and quiet conversations between women who understood that sometimes the world was not fair, that sometimes justice had to be taken rather than given, that sometimes the only way to survive was to become something unexpected, something dangerous, something that hid behind a gentle face and struck only when necessary. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden dangers of underestimation, don't forget to subscribe to Red Chapter, leave your like, and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Because every card game has a winner and every story has a lesson. The most important lesson is this: never assume you know someone's story just by looking at them. Never assume weakness where you see age. And never ever cheat a quiet widow at cards. Until next time, partner, keep your cards close and your assumptions closer, because the most dangerous player at any table is the one you never see coming.